I attended the University of Colorado for my undergraduate, master's, and PhD. The skiing was too good in Colorado to leave. And but I did a lot of work outside of Colorado, a lot of work in Alaska and Canada. I worked for many years at the National Center for Atmospheric Research as an ecologist, traveling with a team of scientists in places like China and Africa and the Amazon and all around the eastern U.S. and western U.S. and Canada, and studying forests and trying to understand health issues with the trees. So yeah, I've had actually quite a bit of experience looking at trees around the world. The most I like about the trees is that they give me and other living things around them strength. They are solid. When I'm working on the trees, I just come away just feeling invigorated. They give a lot of life to the people and their creatures around them. What we're aware of is that the Native Americans understood the ecology of the oak forest probably better than any living ecologist today. They understood the importance of fire. They understood that if you leave an oak forest undisturbed, it won't stay an oak forest. Oaks are what we call early successional species. They tend to be some of the first trees that will come in after a fire or disturbance. But if left alone, they'll get invaded by bay trees or pine trees or other evergreen trees, and over time, these evergreen trees will replace the oak trees. The Indians didn't have quite the number of uses for the evergreen trees as they did for the oaks. The oaks, by producing acorns, provided a huge food resource for the Native Americans and the other animals in the ecosystem that the Native Americans relied on. So by using fire in a very wise way, they were able to essentially arrest the development of the oak ecosystem and keep it at an oak stage indefinitely. And they did this for thousands of years by employing fire periodically to keep the young oaks from and young bay trees and evergreen trees from coming in and replacing the oaks, keeping the oaks thinned out so they're not too crowded, and also keeping the soils alkaline. The ash from the fires will alkalinize the soils. And yeah, they basically were able to keep these oaks alive for many hundreds of years longer than they would have lived if they hadn't been tended. Even going so far as to taking the trees and pollarding them. And pollarding is a practice that we see in many places around the world, where the trees, when they are young and the tops are cut off, actually repeatedly for several years, and that creates a lot of major lateral branches, which then come up and create a very broad spreading canopy like you see in typical orchard trees. Most orchard trees are pollarded to some extent, and this shape, this broad spreading shape with many lower branches, turns out to be the most efficient shape at maximizing fruit or nut production in an oak tree. I've seen oaks in many natural environments, and I find that oaks really don't live much longer than 100, maybe 200 years at most before they're replaced by later successional species. But here in California, when I first came here, I'll never forget, I did a study back in 1998 on some oak forests up on the foothills of the Sierras, and I couldn't believe how big and old these oak trees were, and I couldn't understand how was it that these oak trees could be so old, many centuries old, and not having been replaced by later successional species. And that's when I started doing my investigations and came up with an understanding that indeed these oak forests had to have been tended with fire for them to get that old. So I think the Native Americans really understood that these oak trees, if they're kept healthy, can live many centuries longer than they would under untended natural conditions. What we find in many places near the coast, and actually in some cases many hundreds of miles inland from the coast, we find these accumulations of seashells. In the past, archaeologists have looked at these and considered them to be garbage piles, places adjacent to where the Indians were living, where they were simply discarding remains from these feasts. And in these middens, they tend to be dominated by seashells, but there's also bone and rock and ash, and pretty much everything mineral that we find in the lives of Native Americans seems to be deposited there. But then we also realize that these middens were excellent fertilizer. In fact, when white settlers came in, they typically would find these middens and use them to fertilize their fields. The other interesting thing is that the archaeologists, in calling them garbage piles, failed to consider the fact that Native Americans didn't even have a concept of garbage. They didn't even have a word for garbage. Everything was reused and recycled. And then in my research, realizing the importance of calcium and minerals, mineral fertilizers in maintaining the health of the oaks, I came up with the idea that maybe the middens were used to help fertilize the gardens and oaks and other plants that the Native Americans were tending. And the moment I had that idea, I happened to be living right near a very old oak tree that I thought was a Native American era. And I grabbed my shovel and I ran out and I tested my theory that day and dug around the oak tree, and within a half hour I found a whole handful of shells. And this is about 30-40 miles inland from the coast. And at that point I was pretty excited and started looking around other trees, and then found more shells and realized, oh my gosh, these shells couldn't have been really brought there any other way than by Native Americans, and a lot of the pieces started making sense to me at that point. What fires tend to do is produce a lot of ash, not just from the ash directly from burning, but also there's ash that falls from the air, the drifts, and all this ash is fairly rich in mineral nutrients. So without the ash, the trees, if they're going to be healthy, have to be remineralized. So we're going in and actually taking an enriched kind of ash, a volcanic ash, and spreading it on the surface of soils around the trees, fortifying it with extra calcium, since trees, any kind of woody plants need extra calcium, and bringing the pH of the soils up, neutralizing the soils, making them more alkaline, and seeing some pretty dramatic results when we go in. Now, also keep in mind, it's not just the mineralization that's helping these trees. On top of the minerals, we're adding some organic compost to help activate the minerals. You want to do that. And also we're finding that mulching is really important too. Mulching helps prevent mosses from growing on bare soil. Mosses and lichens, actually both, are organisms that produce acids. Mosses and lichens are usually killed off by the fire, so without fire we're starting to get a buildup of lots of mosses and lichens in the trees, which are sources of acidity. So on the ground, what we're able to do by adding the minerals and then mulching very heavily, we're able to eliminate the mosses and lichens, which are damaging the roots and soils of those trees. I think that the first thing that people can do is to understand that forests need tending. They can't be just left on their own. There is this idea that, oh, the oaks have been here for millions of years, just let them alone and they'll be fine. So I think by recognizing that is a key step in solving the problem. Afterwards, I think they need to actually start researching. And I think my website is probably a good place to start. There's a lot of science, and I think it's written in a way that most people can comprehend it. I haven't tried to write over people's heads. I've tried to write, there's actually some popular articles you can download from the website that can help explain the problem. Once you understand the problem, the solution is not too difficult. So people can get alkaline minerals, spread them around the trees. You can also take things like fireplace ash and spread them around the trees. I have a wood stove and I clean that out, and I spread it around the trees every time I clean that out. You want to keep stuff that's growing up around the base of the trees away from the trunks. You don't want any leaves touching the trunks of the trees. I think the best thing is to understand the problem, and then once you have your mind around the problem, you can approach it, and every situation is a little bit different. You need to kind of tweak the treatments depending on the situation.